The first swing of the sledgehammer didn't just crack the cedar siding, it shattered the silence of our suburban neighborhood and the carefully crafted lie my wife had been living for 8 months. I watched through a haze of sawdust as Elena's face went from a pampered, glowing tan to a ghostly, translucent white, her glass of Chardonnay slipping from her hand and shattering on the pavers. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, just a pathetic, dry gasp as she realized the sanctuary she'd built was about to become her tomb of secrets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I was systematically destroying a $50,000 structure on a Tuesday afternoon while our neighbors watched in horror, I need to take you back to where the rot actually started. 2 years ago, if you'd asked anyone in Oak Creek about Mark and Elena, they'd tell you we were the gold standard. We had the renovated Craftsman on the corner, the shared Sunday tradition of biking to a little bistro called the Rusty Whisk, and a marriage that seemed immune to the typical 10-year itch. Elena was a high-end interior designer, and I was a structural engineer. We spoke the same language, or so I thought. We talked about foundations, aesthetics, and building a life that lasted. The first crack appeared last spring. Elena came to me with tears in her eyes, saying she felt stifled. She claimed her creative spark was dying, and she needed a space of her own, a she-shed at the far end of our acre lot, tucked behind the weeping willows. She didn't want a prefab shed from a big box store. She wanted a custom-built, soundproofed, climate-controlled studio. I wanted her to be happy, so I handed her the reins and a significant chunk of our savings. That should have been my first warning, but what came next was so much worse. The construction started in June. Elena insisted on hiring her own contractor, a guy named Greg who she claimed specialized in boutique outbuildings. Greg was younger, had sleeves of tattoos, and drove a truck that looked like it cost more than our first mortgage. Elena told me she wanted the process to be a surprise, so she requested I stay away from the back of the property until it was fully curated. "It's about the energy, Mark," she'd tell me, her voice airy and distant. "If you see it in the ugly phase, it'll ruin the reveal for me." I trusted her. I really did. But then the overtime started. Elena began spending 4 or 5 nights a week in that shed, supposedly working on a career-defining portfolio. She'd come back to the main house at 2 a.m., smelling of expensive wine and a sandalwood incense I didn't recognize. If that was all I found, maybe I could have let it go. Maybe I could have convinced myself she was just obsessed with her work. But then I checked our Ring camera logs. The camera over the garage showed Elena walking toward the shed at 9 p.m. with a bag of groceries, steaks, asparagus, and a bottle of bourbon. I don't drink bourbon, and the camera didn't show her coming back for 6 hours. But the real kicker, the camera also picked up a shadow, a man's shadow, cutting through the side gate at 9:15 p.m. and leaving at 1:45 a.m., every Tuesday, every Thursday. I felt a cold stone form in my stomach. I knew exactly what I was going to do, but I had to be patient. I'm an engineer. I know that if you want to bring down a structure, you don't just hit it anywhere. You find the load-bearing lies. I spent the next 3 weeks acting completely normal. I kissed her goodbye, I asked how the pottery was coming along, and I even complimented the artistic glow she seemed to have lately. Meanwhile, I'd installed a tiny pinhole camera in the one place she'd never look, the high-end industrial AC unit I'd personally helped Greg's crew install. When I finally pulled the footage onto my laptop on a Friday night while Elena was working late in the shed, my blood didn't just boil, it turned into liquid nitrogen. There was no pottery wheel, there were no drafting tables, the she-shed was a luxury bedroom. Silk sheets, a stocked bar, and a sound system that was currently blasting slow jazz while my wife and Greg, the contractor, laughed about how clueless I was. "He actually thinks I'm making vases," Elena giggled on the recording, leaning back against the pillows I'd paid for. "The guy's a nerd," Greg replied, his voice muffled by her hair. "Engineers only see what's right in front of them. They don't have vision." Oh, I had vision, all right. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a one-time thing. This was a lifestyle. They had been using my money on my property to build a clubhouse for their betrayal. I didn't scream. I didn't run down there and catch them in the act. That's too messy. I wanted something cleaner, something structural. I waited for the grand opening. Elena had invited 12 of our closest friends and a few of her high-end clients for a studio reveal party on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd spent all morning decorating the yard with fairy lights and catering from the most expensive deli in town. She was wearing a white linen dress, looking like a goddess of purity. "Are you ready to see my masterpiece?" she asked the crowd, her eyes shimmering with a deceit so polished it was almost impressive. "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "I think we should start with the demolition. The foundation is faulty, Elena. I've been looking at the specs, and the whole thing is rotten." The guests laughed, thinking it was some inside joke. Elena's smile flickered just for a second. "Mark, don't be weird. Let's just open the doors." "No," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying low. "I think the neighbors should see what's inside first." I pulled out my phone and hit play on the Bluetooth speaker she'd set up around the patio, but it wasn't music that came out. It was the recording from 3 nights ago, Elena's voice clear as a bell, mocking me. Greg's voice laughing about my lack of vision. The silence that hit the backyard was deafening. Our neighbor, Mrs. Gable, dropped her appetizer. My best friend Dave looked at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "Elena?" She didn't move. She looked like a statue. "I hired a crew to come by this morning while you were getting your hair done," I said, gesturing to the side of the house. On cue, 2 of my buddies from the construction firm rolled a bobcat loader into the backyard. They weren't there to build. They were there to level. "Mark, stop this," Elena whispered, her face finally losing every drop of color. "We can talk about this." "We did talk," I said, picking up the heavy sledgehammer I'd left leaning against the fence. "We talked about building things that last, but you built this on a lie, and in my profession, when a structure is unsafe, we don't remodel, we condemn." I walked over to the shed. With one massive swing, I took out the front window, the one she'd picked out because it had the best light for painting. The glass exploded inward, revealing the plush king-sized bed and the half-empty bottle of bourbon sitting on the nightstand. The guests gasped. They could all see it now. It wasn't a studio. It was a motel room built with my sweat and her cruelty. I turned to look at her. Elena was shaking so hard she had to lean against a tree. The white of her dress perfectly matched the white of her face. She looked small. For the first time in 10 years, she looked completely transparent. "The movers will be here at 5 for your things in the main house," I said, my voice steady, almost conversational. "Anything left in this shed is going to the landfill by 6. I suggest you grab your bourbon. Greg's probably waiting for a drink."
I didn't stay to watch her cry. I didn't stay to hear her excuses or the frantic whispers of our former friends. I walked back into my house, locked the door, and poured myself a glass of water. The divorce was settled in record time. Turns out, video evidence of a spouse using marital assets to build a literal affair house doesn't play well in court. I kept the house. I kept the lot. And as for the shed, I didn't just tear it down. I had the debris hauled away and replaced it with a simple open fire pit. Sometimes, when I'm sitting out there on a quiet Tuesday night, I watch the flames and think about how much lighter I feel. You see, the thing about being an engineer is that you learn to appreciate the beauty of a clean slate. My life isn't a masterpiece yet, but at least now, the foundation is solid.